We are now fully in the afternoon session. The afternoon session has two substantive segments. The first one coming up is a panel discussion. And after another small recess, we'll proceed with the second evaluation clinic on evaluation for shaping national scale programs, with Sulika Riba giving us some guidance on that topic. But right now, we are going into the panel format, and we are going to discuss partnerships for evaluation for the 2030 agenda. What do we need to do differently, or evaluation for accelerating achievements of the 2030 agenda, more specifically. The session will be moderated by Andrew Five, who's the head of evaluation of the United Nations Capital Development Fund. And the panelists will be introduced by Andrew, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, is this working? Hello? Thank you very much for the invitation, the opportunity to be with you again for a UNICEF learning event on evaluation. I was with you last year for the same day, and it was a very interesting experience, very valuable. On the basis of that, we've been working with Tina on some work within the UN Evaluation Group. So it's a great pleasure to be back. I've been asked to moderate a session around partnerships for evaluation in the 2030 agenda. So this is good. This allows us to sort of raise our gaze, certainly from the day-to-day work of many of us in the evaluation system and our evaluation functions around designing and managing evaluations, and to really think about the broader systems that we're trying to influence. We're of course trying to take things to scale with all of our partners. We heard a lot about scale in the last session, and we can't do that alone. So I think it's a really good opportunity to revisit this topic of evaluation partnerships. We've been working on it as a community for a while, but let's continue the conversation. And I think the focus here is also to try and think about a little bit how we can do things differently. So to help me in this discussion, and we want this to be informal and talk show format, we have an eminent panel of three distinguished colleagues in the evaluation world. First of all, we have Ms. Natalia Nikitienko, who is a parliamentarian from the Kyrgyz parliament. Natalia is serving her second term, and she is currently a member of parliament on parliamentary committees focused on lots of very relevant public policy areas for the SDGs, on social affairs, education, science, public health, not to mention constitutional legislation, judicial issues, and state structure. Natalia is also a steering committee member of the Global Parliamentarians Forum, and of course I think we'll all agree that parliamentarians and parliaments in general are a very important mechanism by which we can really ensure that evaluation makes a full contribution to public policy design and implementation. And so, we're very happy that you're able to join us, Natalia. Secondly, we have Dr. Indran Naidu, who many of us know as the director of the IEO in UNDP. He's been the director since 2012. This is the largest evaluation office in the UN system currently. And Indran also serves currently as the vice chair of the UN Evaluation Group. And I know from my many years working with in the UN Evaluation Group, and Indranee, you've been a very active advocate for UNEG, and as a community that brings us all together within the UN system. Dr. Naidu has provided thought leadership for evaluation over the past 25 years, also from a member state government perspective. And again, we're extremely happy to have you here as part of the panel, Indra. Then our third and final member of the panel is Ms. Veronica Olathabal. I hope my pronunciation is okay. Veronica is a senior advisor and director of measurement, evaluation, and organizational performance at the Rockefeller Foundation. I think, Veronica, you're well known to many of us from your work in our community over the last number of years. You've worked in a number of additional organizations in many continents, including the MasterCard Foundation and the NURA International. And you also serve on the American Evaluation Association's Board of Directors, which we know is one of the biggest and most active evaluation associations that we have. So again, we're very lucky to have Veronica with us. And maybe please join me in welcoming all three panel members. Great. So basically, we have an hour or so to consider this this question. We have three questions for the panelists around this topic. We're going to probably treat the first two together. We'll take it one by one and then open it up. We want this to be very much, participatory. We've all, as I said, been involved in working on evaluation partnerships for many years. So I imagine many have very useful things to say and questions to ask. We're going to we're going to start by asking about sort of evaluation generally and how it can remain relevant in the post-2015 era in SDGs. We know that in the first year or two of the SDGs, perhaps evaluation wasn't as embedded in it as many of us would have liked. So I think, let's think about how it can continue to build and adjust as we go forward. We then are going to focus in on partnerships again within this framework of the 2030 agenda and how we can be perhaps working differently to ensure these partnerships. We'll then open it up to Q&A and make it a more participatory discussion. And then we'll bring it all together in a last question around how can we ensure that all of this supports national ownership of evaluation capacity, because that's of course where where the SDGs are going to be achieved. So maybe without further ado, let's start with the first question. And the first question is as follows. Many discussions, articles, blogs, etc. Are emphasizing that if evaluation is to remain relevant in the post-2015 era, it will need to adapt and adjust. So my question to our panelists is, how can we begin to unpack that statement, and what can we be doing in practice to support evaluation occupying this role? Who would like to go first from the panel in answering the question? Perhaps Natalia, is that okay? I'll pass over to you.
Okay, thank you. And it's really challenging, right? After the lunchtime, and to be the second time in the panel. But I hope this discussion will be very interesting because really SDG, we talk a lot about that SDG, but where we really are in achieving SDG goals and using evaluation on the national, regional level. So just a very short thoughts aloud, when we started the discussion on the national level about SDG, I was very happy that this is the very good entrance point for using evaluation more efficiently and presenting evaluation for decision-making levels, because SDG is obligation of country. It's kind of the official commitments that the countries did, and there is already decision makers who are involved in this process. So that should be very fast and easy. This is what my expectation, from that. because evaluation of SDGs is the integral part of the SDG process, localization, etc. And everything is there: political level involvement, the agenda, the instrumentarium, indicators. So it should work. But now, several years passed, and when I'm really thinking where we are on the, let's say, ownership of SDG and to using evaluation, did it help to promote evaluation on the decision-making level, etc.? Unfortunately, my personal feeling that we're not very good at that. So time is going, and if SDG, from my point of view and feeling, didn't become owned really by many people, nations, and decision makers. Still, in many developing countries, it's kind of the business of some international partners and some decision makers involved in kind of the reporting process. And this is really challenging point to say, because the time goes very fast and we need to do something with that situation. And I think that we still have a lot of challenges in front of us regarding using the, promoting the SDG agenda as it is, and promoting the evaluation of SDG as it is. So the very important thing that should be done is really ownership of SDGs by nations, by people, and now how the process goes on the country level in many countries. International institutions work very efficiently with different stakeholders, with people. And the good news that there is identification, knowledge, and kind of sign from the citizens about SDG. And there is some involvement of some decision makers at some levels in different countries in that. But there is no the linkage between the people who really the final consumers of the SDG and the high level, let's say, decision makers. So still there is kind of the gap. So I think we should be more efficient in finding the ways how to fulfill this gap through the partnership, through methodologies, through dialogues, through making kind of the pressure from the society side to the decision makers, asking the questions. Please tell us where we are with SDG achievement. There should be the questions from the society. I think this is very important power, can make the change. And I think that international institutions work a lot with society, but there should be involvement of key stakeholders, including parliaments and governments, to provide those linkage more efficiently.
Great, thank you. So Natalia, you're really stating the challenge. You know, we're a couple of years into the SDGs, almost 5 years, and yet still this is a real challenge in order to get ownership of evaluation as a tool to help governments and parliaments implement SDGs. Indran, perhaps you'd like to go next.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and congratulations to George and the team for this institutionalized event. We always look forward to it. It's a very important discussion. A few points that I would put on the table. Firstly, we need to ask ourselves the question, evaluation for what? And I would propose that evaluation in order to reduce inequality, which then gives a very different pitch, where we need to move beyond the methodologies, as important they are, but start addressing the political question of how do you use evaluation to stimulate the conversations that bring people together to identify what the inequalities are and how you can work in addressing these. And the SDGs provides a very good development framework, because it's owned by all member states, to have that conversation. So from 2015, when the year of evaluation with the National Evaluation Capacity Series, the largest event by government participation for evaluation globally, we have kept the same topic, SDGs. First in Bangkok, then in Istanbul, and last week in Hurghada, Egypt, with no one left behind, but focused specifically on how can people that engage with evaluation use it in a way that is empowering, that you start to measure, so we can have an honest conversation about whether we're addressing inequalities and no one left behind. So the point I would make is we need to move beyond the advocacy, feel good about evaluation, transparency, democracy. We know that, we've passed that debate, and really get down to what this means practically. And we would know that when we look at the high-level political forums. Now, over the summer, we noted that some 40 VNRs have been presented. Truth be told, most of them are monitoring. It's a good start. But almost 5 years later, there's almost an absence of evaluation. And if you're going to, in the next decade, get to no one left behind, the current pace is not adequate. I think evaluation will put up the results to show how problematic it is and how far we are from the goal. And that's where I come in, evaluation for transformation, but really for action more than, the advocacy part. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Indra. So I think we still agree this is a challenge, but there's opportunities there. It seems you're saying, Indra, in terms of the UN level processes, the SDG reporting, the voluntary national reviews. Clearly, that won't happen automatically, but it's something that we can perhaps think about. Veronica, perhaps over to you.
Hello, thank you very much. And thank you to Ada and to George for inviting me to speak. And hopefully I'll say something that's valuable and interesting. The Rockefeller Foundation, as many of you know, has been around since 1913. We are about 106 years old, we're older than you. And we have a new president. Our focus remains the same, primarily focused around food, health, U.S. jobs and economic opportunities, as well as climate and a couple of other areas. Our new focus, though, is about approaching traditional spaces and places in a more innovative way, and very much thinking about the role of data science and technology. And I'm going to park that for a moment, but I will come back to that from an evaluative point of view. So there are three thoughts that I have in terms of how, from an evaluation perspective, we could be doing things differently. And I'm going to speak wearing my evaluation hat and not wearing my development finance hat. So number one, as evaluators, we can think back to Evaluation 101, when we were taught that the purpose of evaluation is either accountability or learning. And since then, we have probably recited that many times and have talked a lot about the tensions between trying to optimize for both and not very successfully doing one both better than the other, really just living in one space or another. And I think that to me, and as an evaluator, I feel for me, we really need to be thinking differently about that tension. There is a place where we can be thinking both about how evaluation can be contributing to our learning, our adaptive management, our timely decision-making, as well as to the way that we can uphold evaluation, as Indra was mentioning, to very much confirm and validate whether or not we are seeing the direct and the indirect impacts that we, as development sector actors, would like to see. Number two, and so I would challenge us to think about whether or not we can consider different operational models. We were just in a conversation earlier about how within the UN system, you operate differently if you are an independent evaluation office or an independent evaluation group versus an embedded. And we tend to polarize our evaluation practice, which I think has ripple effects to all of what we do from a development sector perspective. Number two, I think we very much need to embrace the data and digital revolution and not see it as exogenous to our work. So I spend a lot of time talking to Silicon Valley, to tech providers, all kinds of things that as philanthropists we get to be exposed to. But I also spend a lot of time talking to development sector practitioners that work within the UN system, work within the development finance and the bilaterals and other multilaterals. And it almost feels as if we talk about the other in a way in which we tend to construct this reality where we see them as either competitive, we see them as lower quality, we see them as, and it goes both ways. I very much think that if we were to think of, from the evaluation perspective, the data and digital tech tools and providers out there as endogenous to our actual work, we would be probably designing differently our evaluation methods and approaches. And so I challenge you with that. And then number three, this relates back to Natalia, something you said earlier, which is we don't really see questions or answers from society. And I think what I would say is, as evaluators, we need to become better listeners. How do we integrate client consumer level feedback into our overall analysis? I think that there are ways, and Michael Bamberger writes about this, ways to be able to generate large amounts of consumer, client, end user insights and triangulate that with some of our household data that makes the whole package a little bit more cost effective. And again, it's not mobile data collection and it's not only household surveys as a bit of a polarizing spectrum. It's thinking about it in a more integrated way.
Great, so that covers very nicely a slightly more sort of deep dive focus on the how, in terms of how evaluation practice can be changing in the various dimensions that you mentioned. I said that I'd go to the audience after question 2, but I think this is such a big question, such an interesting question, that I'm going to maybe go out to you now and just maybe ask you to propose sort of one-line answers to the question, or one-line sort of dimensions that we need to take into account to answer this question. If evaluation is to remain relevant in the post-2015 era, it needs to adapt and adjust. So I guess my question to you is how? In sort of, short one-sentence suggestions, and then we can perhaps come back to it later, and then we'll move on to question 2. So who would like to go first? And we have the microphones, the roving microphones.
Who would like to go first? One sentence. Yeah, Justice?
One sentence.
Okay.
One sentence.
Just really, hitting it to the point.
Okay, I will try to one sentence. I think maybe we need to lower the bar for defining what an evaluation is, because I think countries do so many evidence-related activities to inform their decisions that might not meet the criteria to be called an evaluation. So maybe by lowering the bar, we could at least adapt and be able to survive.
Great. So that's a really interesting, in the literature we hear about sort of the importance of evaluative thinking, and it shouldn't just be evaluators that are concerned about evaluative thinking and doing evaluation better, but we should be, as a community, trying to influence many, many more people to think like evaluators. Great suggestion. Another suggestion from the floor. It's such an interesting question.
People are warming up. Ricardo, one sentence. What a challenge for Italian.
Maybe 2, but 1.
Maybe 2. Okay.
1.5.
Oh, maybe 3 because I've got 12 hours there. So I like the dimension of dynamic and iterative, but also going a bit beyond the traditional data sets that Michael proposed when he was doing research for you guys on Global Pulse. But I do think we also need that transformational dimension, which integrates the feedback loop. So how do we get iterative, dynamic, and integrative feedback loops that are not just upwards accountability, linear learning, but much more, I would say, adaptive in how decisions are taken and tailored to the different contexts. So that's
great. That's excellent. Maybe one last comment, and maybe I'm just going to challenge you. What about this challenge of sort of the politics of evaluation and the trying to get into a political space and promoting demand for evaluation? Does anybody have anything to offer in that? I can see Krishnan from the back.
Thank you. Just to be brief, I think we need to really make sure that evaluation gets to where the need for evaluation is greatest, and it is linked to the action process as well as results and reporting. There's a vast gap out there that we keep talking about, but we have really not succeeded in getting there.
Thank you, Krishnan. That speaks, of course, to the leaving moment behind objective that is at the core of what we're trying to do. So that's great. I'm going to leave it here for now. Please hold your thoughts. Maybe we can come back to the next one. Maybe to the panel, just any reflections or on what you've heard?
Just on the quick point, I agree with the colleague Justice. Yes, the evaluative thinking as a definition for evaluation is probably more encompassing. A few weeks ago, I was at the IDEAS event with some colleagues over here, and it is apparent that evaluation is a profession in definition. It doesn't have the specificity of auditors. We are still small and emerging, and I think the approach of a sort of broad bringing everyone in under the rubric of evaluative thinking is much better. I think we've gone a long way past the learning accountability. Those have been very heated but quite useless debates. You can have both learning and accountability working interchangeably. But there is something that defines evaluation from other activities. It makes a judgment. And that's in the UNEG norms and standards, and that is everywhere. And that means that's where the politics comes in. Because if you're not going to make a judgment, you're not going to actually shake up the waters in order to have an authentic conversation on where do we go from here. Otherwise, it's going to be what we call the kumbaya approach, all is well. And your job is really to be transformative. If not, and you say it's learning, then you really should be a part of really an organization which is the learning component. And I think the evaluation community, even in UNEG, has not defined itself quite clearly there. While it adheres to the norms and standards, in practice it tends not to do so because of the politics.
Great, thank you. Any other reflections perhaps for Nataya?
Regarding the language, I think today in the first session we discussed a lot about like the tailored evaluations and the language with different stakeholders. So again, we're coming back to that issue because this is one of the crucial things. Who needs to be talked about the results and which language? And here, just to give you the demonstration how sometimes linear evaluation goes. And for example, I just heard recently our country is preparing for VNR for next year, and I just heard occasionally the dialogue between some ministers, regarding the preparation on the political level to the VNR. And that was like, a discussion about we will be successful, pretty successful in reporting to the international society because we're meeting the timelines and scales and like some indicators quite clearly regarding the achievement of some indicators. But it wasn't the discussion about like the quality or impact or whatever. It was just the reporting to some international society about the achieving the indicators. Quite obvious attitude and approach. This is what I'm talking about when I say that we need to change the attitude, the understanding, and the modality, the ownership. Otherwise, the evaluation and kind of the reports from the government officials will look like that. Very linear reporting regarding the time frame and respecting some indicators and criteria, not going to the depth, to the talking to people, the stakeholders, etc. And actually, the members of parliament also not very much involved in that discussion. So those people who are talking to people every day, dealing with people, they are also excluded. So it's kind of something that needs to be answered if we want to achieve better results than we have now after 5 years.
And I'll just...
Thank you. Please, Veronica.
I'll just jump in really quickly. It's interesting, the lowering the bar. I also agree, we spend a lot of time talking about that in my world, in the philanthropic world, and part of the challenge with that as an evaluator is holding the bar for what is considered high quality, holding the bucket around integrity, and making that judgment, as Indran mentioned. I think the challenge with that, though, is that then you have to have such a high degree of confidence in the results that it takes a little bit of time to get to that high quality judgment. And so in the Silicon Valley and tech space, we talk a lot about insights. Could we not be evaluatively generating insights? And this is not a monitoring conversation. It's not necessarily a measurement conversation. And it's not a KPI conversation. it's a conversation about how we can not just ask evaluative questions along the way. We can talk a little bit about that, and I know that that was in the readings, and I know that you spent a lot of time talking about that. It's about how to be able to generate those insights that are directionally moving the way that we need it to move or not. And that also answers what I think evaluation does very well, the what and the why. Because the context is critical. How do we get to contextual analysis faster and not just to the KPI? And then back to the point around dynamic and iterative, I completely agree. I think that's our challenge as evaluators. And by the time we get asked to the party, it's past that time of being able to influence any parts of the dynamism or the transformation that has happened. And so I do like this time in which we are living in that we're thinking about how do we incorporate evaluation earlier in that pipeline. And I think the challenge to evaluators is that we spend way too much time talking to each other, and we convince each other of the way to move forward. And I know this segues into your second question around partnerships. I think that if we were to spend more time talking to others and not just to evaluators and reading their literature, we could be problem solving differently around the systems conversation. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I mean, that's a really interesting set of inputs and comments. I mean, you know, how to ensure that we don't give up on the ambition of evaluation in terms of quality, that we don't give up the role of evaluation to support accountability, because these are often public resources that are being spent, but how do we ensure that this is accessible, that the evaluation tools and approaches are accessible, and that we're not just talking amongst ourselves? I think that's a really good set of inputs. I'm not keeping time. Can somebody tell me, we should probably move on to the second question, I guess, right? Yeah. Let's move on. Okay, so, and then we can come back to, there's such an interesting question, we maybe come back to at the end if we have time. So now, the second question, we move into really the focus of today's topic, the importance of partnerships. I mean, clearly this has gained momentum over the years. The initiatives that we've seen internationally in the not-for-profit space, also within the evaluation associations and communities, etc. So my question to the panel is, what are we doing that's good? So what are we doing well in this space of partnerships? Or what should we be doing differently to ensure effective partnerships for evaluation in the SDG era? And I'm going to start with somebody new for the first time, either Natalia or well, I actually started with you the first time, so maybe Veronica, if we could start with you.
Sure, I've lost my mic. Hello. I'm going to start with what should we be doing differently versus what we're doing good, but maybe some of the good will rise and surface. So as I mentioned earlier, I think we need to be doing better at reaching over the walls, and both the physical and the mental ones. Just within the UN system, I have engaged with various different agencies, evaluation teams, independent evaluation offices, as well as some of the innovative departments or offices, such as UN Global Pulse. And I find that every one of those conversations are quite different. And so as we're thinking about the global framework and we're thinking about global partnerships, I do think that it's up to us as individuals and as this development sector participants, not just evaluators, to be proactively pushing the envelope on what we think is normal or what we think is conventional by meeting new people either within the system or outside the system, by going to other events and conferences and convenings. I also think it's about demonstrating our collaborative value. And so part of the challenge, and I think that you mentioned this around the demand part, it's very hard to have your evaluation findings be absorbed into policy recommendations if no one is demanding it to some extent. And from an SDG point of view, I spend some time talking to other actors in the global space around their development finance. I spend time talking to impact investors and private sector investors that are also contributing to the global framework. And I find that those conversations are often refreshing. And back to the earlier discussion around scale, while I spent a lot of time talking about impact on the development finance side, I spend less time talking about impact with the private sector side and spend more time talking about scale. And I see that there are opportunities to be thinking differently and to be problem solving together, if only these two groups of people would speak more to each other. And I think that part of that is about being demanded to, or being asked to the party. And I find that on the private sector side, they're often saying, no evaluators. Evaluators are too judgmental, or evaluators are too, there's a bit of a stigma around what evaluators are. And I think that if we were to be able to demonstrate our collaborative value through our evaluative tools, through our evaluative methods and approaches, and just our knowledge base, I think that we would also be asked to advise and inform on how that part of the development world is working. And then finally, I'll just say that I do think that it's important that we as partners start to be more collaboratively problem solving. This is not, and I've said this a couple of different times, this is not a time when we're thinking, oh, private sector is interested in international development and global development, and oh, it's a regular PPP type of partnership. The times are calling for us to act and problem solve and use our resourcing, both our intellectual resourcing and our financial resourcing differently. And it is no longer a space where we as individuals feel that we're a product of a system. We are the system, therefore we should be doing things differently ourselves.
Great, thank you very much. Interesting also the private sector. I mean, that's something in UNCDF we work on a lot, but let's not forget the role of the private sector in the Addis Ababa action agenda. If we look at ODA, even if it doubles, it's still nowhere near the amounts. So we need to be thinking about how we can work with the private sector and also evaluate work with the private sector. So that's very relevant. Natalia, maybe to you on this question of partnerships.
Yeah, thank you. As you may see, I'm a strong advocate for partnership. I'm sure there is nothing can be done promoting the SDG agenda without involvement of all actors. So definitely there are good examples and opportunities for improving the partnership. For example, on the parliamentary side, I'll give you several examples when pretty good national coordinational institutions were established in African region, in Asia Pacific, in some countries of Eurasia. There are pretty good platforms that were established on the governmental level, including most of the stakeholders, like coordinational units, and namely in the parliaments. They were established as special either committees or fractions or units of members of parliaments from different parties, specifically on SDG. So in those countries, we make kind of short observation where the parliamentarians are involved and raise the agenda. There is quite more obvious that this topic is in the agenda, it's heard on the country level because mass media are involved, different stakeholders are involved, and those committees or platforms in the parliament, they actually raise the SDG topic and they invite the governmental officials and regularly ask questions in front of the people involving mass media very transparently. Where we are, please give us some information, etc. But it's not the case for all countries, honestly. It's just some good examples that should be delivered. I believe that our partnership on the regional level and on the global level might be more efficient, sharing the good examples like that, creating the platforms in the parliaments, involving more stakeholders and just sharing the experience. Another entrance point which might be used, I think, more efficiently, this is VNR, National Volunteer Reviews. I think that many countries, as I mentioned before, they don't really understand that it's not kind of reporting to some donor society, but this is the checking point kind of exercise for the country itself, for national policies, where we are, for the people, where we are with SDG. And this understanding, I think we can work all together more to bring that understanding about VNR. and also to share good practices. For example, I know there are some regional conferences, but they are not so common, I think, for several regions, where countries which already had that experience share with other countries regarding how to prepare, how to perceive the VNR, what should be done, the lessons learned, etc. And I think that this is very obvious instrument, strengthening the regional communication may help many countries to be more efficient. And another thing, this is definitely like the involvement of media sector. I think that we're missing most of the times not using that instrument. And SDG ideas might be shared by the nations, by peoples and citizens, even if, if they listen about that, if they hear about that, if they understand, they start asking questions, keep accountable for the parliaments, through other means and tools. And then it's also a very strong, kind of power that changes the situation. But regarding the coordination platforms, I think this is also like a very important tool that is not very much used efficiently in many countries. So it should be used more efficiently. It should be used more obviously using the political will and partnership from the point of view of politicians. So definitely through our Global Parliamentarian Forum, we work with parliamentarians on SDG to write the agenda, to widen, the borders, the understanding and involvement of parliaments. And I think this is also very important to be better by ourselves, communicating all over the world with our colleagues and writing the SDG agenda.
Thank you. I think that's a really interesting point about the VNRs as not business as usual in terms of a recipient country reporting to donors on development progress, but actually you're reporting to yourselves. And then of course that, the opportunity politically within the UN framework, and perhaps also a kind of peer review element. We know that in international cooperation, peer review is a quite accepted modality, of regions perhaps advancing together.
If I may add just a very short example from my own country. We actually saw really speeding up the things with VNR when we invited the government in the parliament, create this parliamentary group, and actually set up some oversight over the preparation to VNR from the government, over the parliament, and included in this group civil society. So we really saw in practice how that sped up the processes and understanding and changed the modality.
Great, thank you. And then your other point about media, and of course, the demand for evidence across the media is going to differ from what sort of media it is, but certainly as a way to communicate. That's something we shouldn't forget. Indra, on the partnerships question.
I think the first point on the VNRs and what we've seen to date, it's a good start. The fact that you have governments coming in a public domain and saying how they are progressing and what the challenges are is a good start. I think it's also a reflection, the quality of the evidence that comes in is also a reflection of the evaluative oversight architecture in countries. So we need to take that as a given. The point, and we also accept partnerships are fundamental. It's in the SDG document. We talk about reviews. We've had the Bangkok Declaration. We've had the Prague Declaration. All of them talk about a broad spectrum of people that need to be involved in moving SDGs as a collective. But the question I ask as an evaluator, bringing in the partners, the sectors, at the vertical and at the horizontal level, is it done on a basis that it's symbolic to tick box? We now have an NGO, we have this group and that group. Is it genuine, and how do you deal with the power dynamics? And are the groupings that are brought in, are they taken throughout the process? Because quite often in the beginning there is that consultation, but when you come to the actual delivery, maybe here in New York, you actually don't see the non-government and the civil society sector. That probably is, part of it is due to the architecture of the way the VNRs are designed, etc. But I'm yet to see VNRs that actually have a clear theory of change on what it means to cross-section, dissect through all the layers of society and get the voices from the national to the local. in our conversation at the NEC conference last week in Hurghada, local is where it happens. That's what counts. But the reporting is at the national, it's at the bureaucratic. And there's always the question of bias when something falls into the official reporting channels. And the bias tends to be positive, it's all going well, and it tends to often mask the great amount of inequality at the inter and intra-regional and country level that exists. I like the earlier presentation on scale. If you put the scale analysis into the VNRs, you're going to get completely different pictures coming out, depending on how you pitch it. I would argue that right now, the aggregated big picture narrative of VNRs, things are on track. Yes, it's 5 years, it's slow. In 10 years, no one's going to be left behind. I think it is extremely optimistic, and I think getting to that point is going to be quite elusive.
Great, thank you, Imran. So again, let's open it up. This topic about partnerships. What are we doing well, and what should we be doing differently? The topic of partnerships for evaluative evidence into policy making. Over to you, Laurie, perhaps.
Thank you. I think going back to several comments from Ali and others about national governments and the rubber hits the road at national and local level, I think that going forward we need to see national governments as the primary audience for evaluation, because that's where decisions are being made for all children, in case of UNICEF, in countries. In that respect, one of the partnerships, there are many partnerships that could be important, but one of the partnerships we haven't talked about is amongst UN agencies. And since we're representing at least several UN agencies here, I think over the last year, I've been involved in a number of country program evaluations for UNICEF, managing them. And that's brought me in contact with the resident coordinator's office, who is in the process of doing UNDEF evaluations, which in future will be UN SDCF evaluations. And I've been really surprised at our lack of joined upness around evaluation at country level. So if we're going to support national governments through evaluation to bring evidence into decision making, then I think the starting point is having UN country teams that work in a much more strategic way on evaluations at country level, supported by the regional and global level. And I don't see that happening yet. I still see a lot of sort of either itty-bitty evaluations of joint projects, which are not really that much of interest in a strategic way to governments, or very in-house looking at our own business. So I think an important partnership and an important change that has to happen is the way that the UN sets our common norms and standards, which are fantastic. And we have, across the UN right now, we have consensus on norms and standards for evaluation. Having said that, we're approaching evaluation in very different ways across the map.
Thank you, Laurie. I mean, I'm also in UNCDF managing a joint evaluation currently, and of 3 agencies, and we're all very willing, but it's not easy. And I think we should inject a sort of element of humility into this. That if we're used to working in certain ways within different organisations, and this is the UN that we're talking about. Never mind if we're thinking about trying to influence the way the partnerships work within national public policy systems. I think we do have to be humble in terms of it can be quite difficult, but it needs ownership from the top, obviously. Some other inputs from the floor.
Thank you very much. I'm Carolina from Equatorial Guinea. Just on the issue of partnerships, there was an initiative, a platform that was established, Eval Partners, Eval SDGs, I think, that was supposed to create this, synergy, policy coherence, and also partnerships, particularly the issue of South-South collaboration and tribal collaboration could be a very good, linkage to certain capacity of government, because I've been working for UNICEF Plateau in Africa. I can assure you that capacities are very, very low in most of the countries. And we need to strengthen and synergize these partnerships among different countries at different levels. So I'd like to know, what are we doing if this framework is moving or it has stuck, because I haven't seen so much progress since last year when it was launched. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then perhaps at the back.
Hi, I'm Anna Rester from the Libyan Country Office for UNICEF. One of the things that I haven't heard much discussed is around the humanitarian development peace nexus and the implications in terms of evaluation and programming, etc. I'd be interested to hear a little bit more discussion about how that affects partnerships and where that's located in larger SDG conversations and evaluation, et cetera.
Again, I think there was somebody beside you as well, just behind you. Yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment on the previous question, but also come back to the partnerships. Belize was one of the first countries to participate in the VNR process. We submitted our report in 2017. At the time, the architecture within the country for generating data, reliable data around progress on implementation of those commitments was very, very young. And it still is in many ways. And I think that that's one of the realities that we have to deal with. The quality of the data sources that we have to contribute towards evaluation or any kind of assessment is an issue. So we relied as UNICEF on the mix, but it, again, provided historic data, if you like, because it too was not too recent. But the question I think that we have to consider is, given the expense of evaluations and the long period of time that it takes to complete one, we do have to look at the question of the administrative systems, the strength, the quality of the data coming out of those administrative systems, so that they give us the kind of granular insight that we need to have on an ongoing basis to answer those 6 questions that were highlighted in the discussion of country evaluations, the policy, the two-pronged policy, and give a better sense of issues of equity at the different levels and inform allocation of budgets. The administrative systems, if we can get them to be stronger, can really help us address some of those gaps. But back to the first question. So back to the first question. This discussion reminds me about the discussion of WHO around the rigor of evidence to inform global guidance. And we do, as one speaker said, have to be careful about boxing the evaluation community outside of the mainstream community, and the partnership helps us get to that. The standard for evidence from the WHO guidance perspective was always RCTs as the gold standard, but that has shifted now to include a lot more participation in the guidance development process because of the different perspectives that's offered through clients affected by policy and so on. So I really hope that our discussions with the evaluation community here can take a leap from that and really work ways into our process to ensure that we are looking at alternative sources of data to feed into our recommendations and not limiting it to, again, a standard of evidence that may not really meet with the capacity and the resources on the ground.
Great, thank you very much. So maybe to the panel, there's a number of issues that were raised there around the quality of data, and we have to think also, I think, about mandate. We're evaluators. We are not necessarily responsible for, setting up data systems in the first place, although we may have a role in evaluability. Any reflections on, perhaps the performance so far of Eval Partners, these initiatives that have been set up, recognizing the huge capacity constraints are there, and then there was something on the humanitarian development peace nexus, and again around partnerships and evaluation. So please, panel, over to you.
Let's start. If I may, about evaluation as the Eval Partners and Eval SDGs, right? Just I think that this initiative that was really in time and so much needed. And I represent Global Parliamentarian Forum, which is also established and supported by Eval Partners. And Eval SDG, I know that there is a big work which is done on the global context and in the regional context regarding the involvement of different stakeholders. And there is a very good jobs and some resources online, etc., which are accumulated. But what I think we definitely should do is to be more efficient in presenting ourselves as Eval Partners, Eval SDG, Global Parliamentarian Forum, mapping ourselves. This is actually the homework for us as representative of different branches established by EVAL partners. And I think that there is big mission and also big expectations from that job. Already there is so much have been done. So I would take that as a kind of the homework to be more efficient, more presented in the global and regional arena. And also just a short comment regarding the Belize experience that you mentioned, that after the VNR, their facilities, let's say, for collecting data, etc., were established, and this is very good, you know, it's really so much help for the country establishing the evaluation system using the entry point as SDG evaluation and VNR as one of the tools. So I think that this is also very much important and very much linked with another topic, how to help build capacity on the national level, because donors really are spending a lot of money for sometimes helping governments to prepare for VNR as an exercise. We know that, you know, so big discussions are organized, big money are invested sometimes in consultancy for the governance, etc. But I would rather say that it's important to invest money in establishing, build the capacity, not just working with particular people in the government because they will be changing, etc. But to invest also in local partners, in methodologies and procedures, in legislation, to use this entry point of VNR and to create some facilities, you know, that will work, you know, for a long time, for long-term perspective, because they're quite fragile, honestly speaking, in the developing countries and very donor-oriented. So I think this is an important point, and thank you for raising that.
Great, thank you. Any other responses? Veronica, it's working, yeah?
Is it working?
Otherwise,
I don't know.
Jim?
Just a couple of quick thoughts. I think that, Ms. Hadia, you raised earlier that you raised the question in a statement. The question very much connects to the standard of evidence piece and really questioning what those standards should be. You know, often we ask ourselves, or we in the not UN system ask ourselves, well, who is the audience? Because different levels of evidence, different levels of robustness, different proofs of evidence and standards are reach and connect and are absorbed by different audiences. And in a global agenda space where we're talking about people and planet and not just some people and some parts of the planet, all of them, you have different audiences that we really need to get better at addressing the evidence needs around. And right now I feel that we're having a very homogeneous conversation around one level of evidence, and clearly there's different spectrums. How do we think about some of the epistemological types of things that surface when we start to question the different segmentations of audiences that are out there? I think is an important question. The other piece is, I also manage many joint evaluations, and it's not, as you probably do too, it's not only multilaterals and bilaterals that I'm speaking to. My joint evaluations also are comprised of philanthropies, high net worth individuals, and other private sector entities out there who are progressive and are conducting evaluation of their portfolios. And I do have to say that it's like an analysis. The more variables, the more complex it is. And so, you know, trying to figure out how to conduct joint evaluations where the rubber hits the road at the local level, you know, I'm not sure. You end up negotiating towards the middle of the road, and I think that very much waters down the actual impacts that we should be driving towards. So we just need to think about that differently. But I agree, like we need to figure out what that vehicle looks like in a different way. The administrative data conversation. So I spend a lot of time talking to data scientists and machine learners, machine learning experts. And number one, I think that we as evaluation practitioners, to my earlier comment, need to actually understand what that means. And what big data actually is and what machine learning actually is in terms of methodologies and methods for analyzing our own data. But we spend a lot of time talking about that administrative data piece. And the one thing that becomes really clear to me that while we're not, if we forego the expense of organizing our administrative data and assume that the evaluation is going to somehow miraculously solve all of our problems, And we go into the space of thinking that the administrative data just needs to be better harvested. My experience has been that we spend just as much time and effort and money and transactional costs in looking at the administrative data. And so I think that there's certainly a win there, and I think that we do need to be in a better space of thinking about data quality generally speaking. I don't think that the spectrum or the pendulum should swing towards only administrative without evaluation. There's a happy middle somewhere there that I'm exploring with some pilots. And then finally, no, there's no finally. I actually don't have anything to add to the question around the humanitarian and development nexus, and I would hope that my colleagues do. Thank you.
Thank you. Is that something, Adrian, that you perhaps take?
No, I haven't thought about it as much. Yes, I think Veronica and Natalia have articulated very clearly the issue. I would just come back a little more optimistic and say that the fact that you have the VNRs, it's some incentive for governments to report on how they're dealing with SDGs, in itself is a good motivation to bring about better domestic conversations. And it's a useful entry point. It does magnetize discussions. It varies across the globe, depending on resources, administration, the nature of democracy, the nature of civil society, and multiple factors. But we need to take each for what it is. I don't think you're ever going to get a point where you're going to start measuring countries on the basis of the VNRs, because it reflects a lot more, and this is a very useful conversation. Hence partnerships.
Okay. So thank you very much. That brings us now to the third and final question, and to try and bring this together really, and sort of thinking ahead more systematically. So how does the panel feel that we can move towards more effective and inclusive partnerships around evaluation capacity development overall? I think a lot of the elements perhaps have been raised over the course of the conversation, but bringing it all together, what are maybe the 2 or 3 elements that we need to introduce or we need to really focus on going forward into the last 10 years of the SDGs? I mean, we should be conscious of where we are in the planning framework. And I know that there's been quite some work, and some of you have been involved in this quite a lot already. So, Injan, maybe to you first.
Don't want to preempt announcement that's going to come quite soon. But 3 of the big evaluation capacity development initiatives globally are NEC, IPTED, and CLEAR. But they've been operating on different timelines in different parts of the world, not with the same agenda. So there is a move, and we have already presented a draft proposal to the United Nations Evaluation Group constituency for a more coherent partnership where these 3 flagships are under one umbrella with better funding, more predictable resources that then is able to roll out at a continental and country level, taking into account the regional specifics as required for evaluation. The problem with all 3, in some way or the other, it's almost like a one-size-fits-all. And a key point that continually came through in our tech conference last week was context matters. Context frames. Do not disregard context. And it is for that reason that some of the pontification about what criteria is and how things should work have actually not worked. Because when it comes to the reality of the historic and political circumstances in a country, you need to change, you need to modify. So I think coming to the word that you use, we need to be very modest and humble about what we mean by capacity. But capacity is not just about going for a training and getting a certificate and putting it onto your desk. A lot of the actual conduct of evaluation in itself is building of capacity. And I think the eval youth and the eval partners and the other groups, in bringing together people, we need to look at these informal learning. Veronica has spoken about the technology. There's multiple streams that are going to be used. And I think in many ways, from an evaluation point of view, we're still sort of stuck in the old logic of input, output, and how you're going to get trained and certified before you're going to go out there. All experience counts, both the formal and the informal. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So I think that's useful, exciting to hear, but the international community and some of the international initiatives working more effectively and better together. I'm wondering, Natalia, from your perspective, parliamentarian, part of a global parliamentarian group, any insights in terms of how to go forward on this?
Yes, actually continuing the EVAL partners topic, I think that actually building the capacity is definitely much more than just like trainings and working on the different levels. This is about people bringing the new generation, new thoughts, new ideas around like SDG, around evaluation. And I think that the EVAL partners did already the great job, but it might be needed some more to disseminate the outcomes, the results that EVAL partners have on the global, regional, and national level. So this is, again, a very important topic for really capacity building. And as for parliamentarian forum, so we developed the regional parliamentarian groups. So for the last years, we had the Global Parliamentarian Forum, and just maybe 5 years ago, the Global Parliamentarian Forum started from 3 or 4 members of parliaments who actually asked the questions and were in the context of evaluation. And for a very short, historically short period of time, now there is more than 100, 200 countries. Members of parliaments and institutions are involved in that. So for the very short period of time, there is pretty good success. And I think this work should be done. It's also a very important part of like capacity building and this big understanding of that. And building the regional platforms on exchange regarding the SDG and VNR on the decision-making level, on the level of different stakeholders. I think this is important. Because, the high-level meetings, they're here mostly in New York, and just the top leaders are coming, and someone here said that, who is presenting there? Are there on those meetings some civil society representatives or different groups, vulnerable groups representatives, or at least members of parliaments who actually got the votes of those vulnerable groups and present their voices? Are they there in these meetings? No. It's very kind of them, sometimes, if I may say, kind of closed meetings. But maybe we need to create some kind of discussions of also high political level, on the regional level, to disseminate the results, to share the experiences, to widen the borders. And definitely on the national level also there is a lot of work should be done. And I think this is creating the different legal platforms, coordinational units involving different stakeholders, some procedures of communication. And I think this investing in that type of capacity building rather than just like hiring consultants, for some governments, I think that will be worth and has the long-term effect.
Great, thank you very much. Veronica.
And I certainly defer to my 2 co-panelists as the experts, and will only humbly add a couple of things. Number one, it thrills me as someone who's actually on the funding board for CLEAR and IPDA and many of the other evaluation capacity efforts out there, that coherence and cohesion is soon to be an actual reality, because that has caused a lot of fragmentation, I think, in the space. In terms of how we use our resourcing to support evaluation capacity. So that makes me excited. My concern around that, though, is that there are a couple of subjects and topics that we talk about in principles and we talk about in theory, but we don't really have the tools or the curriculum to be able to actualize them. And one, my colleague Salvi Gariba has been talking about a lot with many of our South-to-South types of partners around decolonizing data, and I would say evaluation as well, given that our current methods and methodologies and tools are very north to south. They just are. And so if we're thinking about the national capacity in government, parliamentarians, and actual people that don't live in our northern or western hemispheres, the tools that we're using to assess them are clearly probably decontextualized. So that's one thing for us to think about in terms of evaluation capacity building. The other piece that Natalia raised around, really around next generation evaluation. I've been talking a lot about next generation evaluation, and that is something that I have lots of conversations about. And when the rubber hits the road, as someone who sits a little bit outside of your system, but is somewhat part of your system, I find myself thinking that the ways that evaluation capacity rolls out in the South is very much DAC evaluation principles driven. And I know that we are in a moment of rethinking them. My sense is we'll still land where we were before. But I think the modalities of how we're interpreting and delivering these higher level principles needs to somewhat, that paradigm needs to shift. And we very much need to be thinking about, what is right and contextual for today, given that our audience is broad. When we think about evaluation capacity, are we thinking about things like data audits? Are we thinking about things about impact management? Are we thinking about these concepts that we're thinking about already in the impact investing and private sector and innovative finance spaces? Because those groups are getting bigger and they're influencing. I know that within Unison, for example, there are some tests around thinking about impact management. And I think we need to embrace this time and evaluation capacity as something that is different, and we may need to pivot and not forego all of our excellent work that we've done with many of the evaluation type teams that are out there, but really think about harnessing that and making it something that is more of this generation.
Great, thank you very much. I'm told that our time is up, so I would love to open it up, but let's open it up to the coffee break, if there's a coffee break coming. I'd like to thank the panel. I mean, I think we've ended on an optimistic note. I mean, clearly the space is opening up. The SDGs are affording that. There's work in the international community to provide a more effective and better contribution. Politics in this is key. So I've been so interested to hear your insights as a parliamentarian and as part of the Global Parliamentary Forum in a way to try and, get back to our constituencies, people that really expect from policymakers effective public policy. Again, I think this has been an interesting discussion. Thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you to everybody from the floor, and I encourage you, let's continue the conversation today in this forum, but also in our community more broadly. Thank you, and please
Thank you very much, and you already drank your coffee, so we have no coffee on the floor. In 5 minutes we can come back. Let's say 5 to 7 minutes we come back, and we go for the clinic by Suli Gariba, and we know that Suli is not going to use all of his 90 minutes because he's declared so. So all of a sudden we are back on track to finish at 5:30. If we come back in 5 to 7 minutes, please. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
And also, do you want us to change the stage a little bit?
I think I would rather walk up. Because